In this chapter, we'll talk about social control and deviance. What is deviance? What are some examples of deviance? Define crime. What is crime? Who decides what is criminal, and how should criminal behavior be sanctioned? Deviance breaks the norms of society. A society must decide collectively on how to respond to deviance. Therefore, deviance works to uphold people together. What are some examples of deviant acts that break social norms? How do we, as a society, usually respond to these transgressions of the moral code? Watch this video and find out how deviance creates social unity. Deviance isn't necessarily bad, it's just different from what the group considers to be normal. When sociologists use the term deviant, they're making a social judgment, not a moral one. Deviance is referring to an act of behavior that is simply different from what the majority group typically does, and thus it generally receives a negative response. For example, in the United States, eating your guinea pig would be considered deviant because most people don't do that. But in Peru, many people eat guinea pigs as part of their diet. Eating or not eating guinea pigs isn't wrong, or at least as equally wrong as eating any other animal. But depending on the culture that you're from, it can definitely be different from the group norm. In regards to this image here, it's of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he's considered not only to be maybe deviant in his time, but a criminal. We wouldn't necessarily call him criminal now. Again, this illustrates how our culture and our response to deviance creates these norms and definitions of what is deviant and criminal. Without seeing deviant behavior, we would have a hard time classifying what is normal. It isn't until our group norms are challenged that we come together as a group to defend these norms. For example, the tragic events following the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001 challenged a norm that many people in the United States took for granted: safety. When those norms were challenged by the attacks, new policies and procedures were put into place, for instance, airport security, to preserve that norm. Emil Durkheim theorized that social cohesion is established either through one of two ways: mechanical solidarity or organic solidarity. So mechanical solidarity is more likely to be descriptive of agrarian societies, where people are ritualistically similar. They do similar types of activities. They think they have common ideas. Whereas organic solidarity is when people unify despite their diversity, despite their size of their population. And so today we are under organic solidarity. We live in an interdependent society. Because we have so many different types of jobs, we need one another. So if you think of the United States, we are a rather diverse group. However, you think of smaller groups like college students at your school, you may find many similarities. In many societies, you can find examples of both mechanical and organic solidarity. Do you think we have a more punitive justice or rehabilitative justice in the United States? What are the pros and cons of each? Rehabilitation has different degrees of success or failure depending on the crime committed. However, even though rehabilitation is usually less expensive than incarceration, there tends to be more sentences of incarceration than rehabilitation. Why do you think this is? Are there certain crimes that you think could receive more rehabilitation than incarceration? For example, what should we do for people who abuse drugs or possess drugs? Do you think we should use punitive justice or rehabilitative justice? We generally don't question why we comply to society's norms. For instance, on the first day of class at the grocery store, why do we use checkout lanes and cashiers? Could there be a more efficient system? We just go along with the status quo and don't question why these systems are in place. For instance, in this illustration, these three men are wearing ties and suits. Why is this necessary? What does the clothing really mean? And are any of them looking deviant from the others? Look closely at the image, and what does that deviance really represent? Earlier we talked about norm breaching. We said that if you breach an important norm, you'll get a bigger response than if you breach a relatively unimportant norm. The response that you receive could be an informal social sanction. If someone tells you that you're not supposed to act that way, dress that way, or talk that way, then they are trying to get you to conform to what they consider to be a norm. Your friend might tell you, "Don't drive too fast, you're going to get pulled over." While your friend doesn't have the authority to make you drive slower, he or she is reinforcing the norm and reminding you of a formal social control that legally enforces that norm. The same might be said for smoking. Your friend might tell you to quit smoking marijuana but cannot arrest you. A police officer, on the other hand, can write you a ticket for driving too fast or, depending where you are smoking, fine or arrest you for drug possession. And as we know, several states now have legalized medical use of marijuana, whereas Georgia still considers that a crime. Let's talk about formal social control and how it's contextualized. How one place it's criminal and one place it's legal, depending on the situation. Dr. Victor Rios discusses his research on gangs and the policing of Black and Latino boys. In this interview, Rios is talking about youth control complex. He focuses on Black and Latino young men. Rios is claiming that this youth control complex controls the lives of many young Black and Latino men. Does the youth control complex described by Rios also control other groups of young people, such as white and Asian boys and girls of all races? Are there other youth control complexes that survive youth control complexes that supervise these groups to a greater extent than one another? So watch the video and think about how Black boys and Latino boys are regulated by the state. Now we'll discuss theory, starting with Robert Merton. Robert Merton's strain theory argues that deviance occurs when a society does not give all of its members equal ability to achieve socially accepted goals. This theory is also called structural strain theory. It acknowledges that there are certain goals that society deems acceptable. Can you think of any goals that we have in society? What are some common things we all strive for? Some things we might strive for are a nice car, big house, a family, good job, lots of money, and things like that. The typical American dream. Strain theory discusses the difficulties that many people have in trying to achieve these goals or the American dream. The frustration that occurs between knowing what the goals are and not being able to achieve those goals is the basis of Merton's strain theory typologies. Here are some categories of that typology. First is the conformist. Conformists are those individuals who work hard in school, go to college, get a job, and save money because they want to buy a nice house, have a prestigious car, wear expensive clothes, and contribute to the retirement plan. So the typical pattern in American society. Next are the innovators. Innovators are people who want the same things that the conformists want: a nice house, nice car, expensive clothes, and so on. But they aren't interested in going to college and working their way up the company ladder. What are some examples of other people who are innovators? They want the goal, but they don't have the same means to reaching those goals. Some examples could be like Bill Gates. He dropped out of college to achieve this extraordinary amount of wealth. Drug dealers can make quite a bit of money, but they're definitely not following the typical means to achieving that. And celebrities, they are usually very rich or wealthy, but typically don't go to college to get that job to move up the ladder. They have all found different means to achieving the culturally accepted goals. Next are ritualists. Ritualists don't seem to think about the goal or the big picture. Instead, they live their lives day to day, paycheck to paycheck. They go to work, they have a steady job, and so on. But they probably live in a modest rental apartment or in their parents' basement. They don't talk about career moves or retirement. They just maintain their daily routines. It may be difficult for you to think of popular examples of ritualists because famous people generally don't present themselves as ritualists. However, you may think of a character on a television show or movie who can probably fit that model. Next are retreatists. Retreatists aren't interested in the goals, nor do they follow the day-to-day routine to achieve those means. Retreatists have often withdrawn from society completely. An example could be a hermit or a person who goes into the mountains to live in the wild. While it is possible that a person would give up their home because they want to withdraw from the system, we have to be careful when we define who is a retreatist. We may think that someone may be a retreatist because they give up their home and they withdraw from society. However, be careful to make the assumption that a person is a retreatist. They may, on the other hand, be a person who does not have a permanent address by choice. We call these individuals homeless. Next are rebels. Rebels are those people who don't accept the goals of society and disagree with the means of achieving them. That means that these people don't covet such things as lots of money, a fancy house, or a nice car. They want to reform society completely. The next theory we'll talk about is symbolic interactionism. Symbolic interactionists zoom in on the individual level and try to figure out how a person interacts with others and how he or she is responding to the surroundings. A sub-theory of symbolic interactionism is labeling theory. People unconsciously notice how others see or label them, and over time they internalize these labels and come to accept them as truth. People then behave in accordance with expectations surrounding the label they've been assigned or that's been assigned to another. In this way, deviance becomes a social construct. Labeling individuals can lead to those individuals acting out their labels. This is especially true if the labels are anchored or confirmed among many agents of socialization. For example, if a child is labeled as bad by the parent, and then by the school, and then after school care program, and then by friends, the label is more likely to become part of the child's self-perception. Labeling theorists call the first act of rule-breaking primary deviance. After you are labeled a deviant, you might begin behaving differently as a result of the way people think about and act toward you. Others' expectations about how you will act affect how you do act. Secondary deviance refers to deviant acts that occur after primary deviance as a result of your new deviant label. So for instance, if you were caught stealing from a store one time, but several people saw it or heard you stealing it, they may start to think of you and treat you differently. And so you internalize this idea that you are a thief, and they continue on reconfirming that belief. Stigma can be physical, moral, or tribal. For instance, a physical impairment might stigmatize or devalue a potential employee from a workplace. A moral stigma could include character flaws, for instance. A moral stigma could include character flaw, for instance, talking too much, which could devalue a person's input in a group setting. A tribal stigma could be based on a membership in a discredited group, such as a club or an organization that a person chooses to belong to, or a group that a person is born into, such as ethnicity or socioeconomic status. Just like deviance, stigma will depend on the culture and context. Next, we'll talk about Philip Zimbardo's broken window theory of deviance. Do you think that people would be more likely to vandalize a car in a rundown neighborhood than in a gated community? This theory tells us that they would, but not because there are more criminals in that area. Instead, people might be more likely to vandalize a car because in that context, it looks like vandalism is more acceptable. Next, I'd like for you to think and also share your ideas. What are some social institutions that influence crime and incarceration rates? So this is about thinking about the macro level of society. We'll focus on three particular institutions: the economy, education, and judicial system. And the question for you is this: how does having or not having economic resources influential in the probability of being incarcerated? So let's talk about how the economy affects the judicial system. First, it's costly to taxpayers. One lifetime without parole offender costs taxpayers on average $500,000 over the course of the prisoner's lifespan. And this is for the context of Louisiana state system. $180 million in total would be saved if sentencing statutes were revised to eliminate lifetime without parole for nonviolent offenses.